Why is India now asking for American, French, British, and Russian engine makers to simply hand over metallurgical secrets those countries have spent decades and untold billions perfecting? And why, if India gets a deal signed tomorrow, its next generation fighter aircraft is still, by the time it actually enters service, obsolete? Today on Radar Mode, we go past the headlines about the current engine shortage and into the real mechanics of the crisis, the 4 decades of history of delay, and why nobody can just swap in a different fighter engine when talks get difficult, and why the technology India is asking for isn't the kind of thing that can be just handed over in a contract, no matter how much money you put on the table. My name is Qasim, and you're watching Radar Mode on Pakistan Connect. If you have followed Indian defense news in the past week, even loosely, you'll have seen the headlines about General Electric Aerospace, which is the American engine making company which supplies engines for all the major aircraft, including the F-22, the F-15, the F-14, the F-16. Why has GE Aerospace missing engine delivery deadlines for the Tejas Mk1A? It seems a bit out of character for a world-class company which has had an excellent record in producing engines. The story is real, and we're going to get into it. But if we stop there, we're only telling about a fifth of the story. The Tejas program has been running into delays since before some of you who are watching were even born. It was conceived in 1983. The same year, Pakistan was actually flying an operative service, the F-16 Fighting Falcon, into the service for the first time. 4 decades is not a production delay. At a certain point, it becomes a generational inheritance, something Hindustan Aeronautics Limited hands down from one leadership to the next, like a family heirloom nobody quite knows how to fix. So today we're doing this properly. We'll walk through the long history of delay, the reasons that go well beyond any one engine contract, why India's current wish list from its engine suppliers is frankly unrealistic, and why walking away and picking a different engine isn't the easy fix it sounds like on paper. It's not. So let's set the scene. The Light Combat Aircraft Program, which would eventually become the Tejas was conceived in 1983 to replace the aging MiG-21 fleet that had been IAF's backbone since 1963, also called the Flying Coffin because of the kind of crashes and its safety record that it had. The plan called for the first aircraft to be built by 1994, an ambitious but reasonable 11-year timeline for a country attempting its first serious fighter jet program from scratch. But here's what actually happened. First test flight January 2001, 18 years after the program started. Initial operational clearance in 2011, 28 years in to the program. Final operational clearance in 2019, 36 years in. And the first squadron wasn't formed until July 2016, 33 years after the idea was put on paper. In the same stretch of time, the United States designed, built, and fielded the F-22, the most modern aircraft of the 5th generation you can think of. Then moved on to the F-35 even. China went from flying aircraft based on the 1960s old aging Soviet designs to rolling out its own indigenous stealth fighter, 5th generation, the J-20. India was still working out on how to get its first jet into a single operational squadron. Even today, after multiple groundings, Tejas Mk1 fleet numbers under 40 aircraft. There have been some crashes, but the Indian Air Force is not quite eager to share this data, as we've seen in Operation Sindoor. And the pattern repeats at the contract level too, not just the program level. The first production contract was signed in March 2006, and it took a full 10 years to form a squadron under it. The second contract, signed in December 2010, took until May 2020 to produce the squadron. The current engine crisis isn't an aberration for Hindustan Aeronautics. It's simply the latest chapter in a style that we have seen since the past few decades. It would be lazy to blame all of this on just the engine, because the other reasons tell you just as much about why this program has moved at a snail's pace. Start with scope. The Indian Air Force has been notoriously kept revising its requirements throughout the development phase, adding capabilities and changing specifications, and every change meant redesigning, retesting, and recertifying entire subsystems. A bit like commissioning a tailor to make you a suit, but then walking back every few months to say, no, though I want to change the fabric, I want to change the cut, I want to change the design, and being surprised the suit is not ready. But then there's bureaucracy. Funding was repeatedly delayed by political and economic crises during the late 80s and early 90s. The full prototype funding was not released until 1993, 10 years after conception. American sanctions following India's 1998 nuclear tests cut off access to components India had been counting on, forcing yet another round of redesign. Quality control has been a recurring headache too, and not just in the ancient history. In 2012, the entire Tejas fleet was grounded for over 3 months after ejection system problems. As recently as early 2026, the Mark I fleet was grounded again for nearly 2 months after a braking system software fault. This is the software that the Indians have been very proud of saying that they've developed in house. Then there's a structural issue underneath all of this. For most of the program's life, Hindustan Aeronautics has been the only real production option for Indian fighter jets. A state-owned monopoly facing limited outside competition and limited accountability. Very limited accountability. When there's a genuinely one company in the country capable of building your fighter jets, that company doesn't face the commercial pressure to hit deadlines that a competitive market would impose. Before we get to General Electric, it's worth pausing just a bit to see why India ended up dependent on American engines in the first place. We all know that they've had excellent relations with the Russians and they have been using, overhauling, assembling Russian engines for quite some time. Why would they go to General Electric and the Americans for this? It's not because of not trying. They did try to make their own engine. In 1986, DRDO's Gas Turbine Research Establishment launched the Kaveri program, an attempt to build a fully indigenous engine so that the aircraft meant to symbolize self-reliance would actually be self-reliant, propulsion included. By 2008, over 2 decades in, it was formally dropped from the Tejas combat program after failing short of the thrust a modern fighter needs, largely because of metallurgy and high temperature turbine blade technology in the hot components of the engine. India's industrial base just had not mastered yet. GRE kept developing derivative versions for another decade. And by the time the original program was formally wound down in 2021, total spending on the Kaveri program had reached roughly $240 million. Sounds a lot, but comparing to the Europeans, it was just a fraction. Europe spent $1.6 billion developing the Eurofighter's engine, or the $6.7 billion US spent on developing the F-35's engine, the F-135. The aircraft that was supposed to fly on an Indian engine, and the engine is the heart of an aircraft, has flown on an American engine ever since. And that figure is a big part of why the leverage General Electric holds now over Mark 1A, the Mark II, and the AMCA. This is why this all exists. Which brings us to the immediate crisis. In August 2021, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, or HAL, signed a $716 million contract with General Electric for 99 F404 IN-20 engines to power the Mark 1A. This is the first batch. These deliveries were meant to begin in February 2024. General Electric had delivered 65 F404 engines, these are the earlier types, for the original Tejas Mark 1A by around 2016. But once that order was finished, there was no follow-on order. The Indians did not place another order to make more engines. In which case, since there was no contract in sight, GE shut the production line down entirely, dismantling tooling and dispersing its trained workforce, because there were no other countries which were ordering the F404 engines. So when India had finally made up its mind and it returned to GE in 2021 with an order of nearly 1.5 the size of the previous order, General Electric wasn't restocking a shelf. It was resurrecting a production line that had sat dormant for 5 years. It was shut down for 5 years. And this process was complicated further by a South Korean component shortage, post the COVID 19 supply strain and disruption from the conflict in West Asia. By mid 2026, only 6 engines had actually reached HAL, and even the sixth failed post delivery quality checks before HAL even resolved it as a shipping calibration issue. It is said that roughly 14 Mark 1A airframes are sitting, painted, ready, simply waiting for power plants. HAL has now invoked liquidated damages against General Electric, while the Ministry of Defense is separately weighing penalties against HAL for missing its own February 2024 rollout target. GE says formal induction should begin around August or September 2026, with 15 to 20 more engines arriving by December to get 24 jets delivered by the end of the year. And in a decision that raised eyebrows, HAL signed a second, even larger order with GE in November 2025 for a further 130 engines, even while the first order was still visibly lacking and failing and delayed. And the engine is not the whole bottleneck. Yes, the engine is not the major bottleneck anymore. The chairman of Hindustan Aeronautics, D.K. Sunil, admitted in July 2025 that software optimization, radar maturation, and missile integration issues were compounding the delay independent of the engine shortfall itself. The indigenous Uttam AESA radar from DRDO's LRDE still hasn't been cleared for Mark 1A, so as for most projects, is still in the design phase. So HAL has fallen back to the Israeli-made ELTA ELM 2052 instead, quietly lowering the jet's indigenous content on what was billed as a flagship Make in India platform, getting the radar to talk directly or communicate directly to the electronic warfare suite and the Astra missile firing systems through the mission computer has needed round after round after round after round of software correction. And the HAL IAF program review meant for April or May 2026 for push to June for lack of progress to show. The Indian Air Force has not stayed quiet about any of this. At Aero India 2025, Chief of Air Staff Amarpreet Singh told HAL leadership he was, in his words, just not confident in that company, and pointed out that jets on display that day weren't even real, not the Mark 1A at least, since the weapons and full capability had not been integrated yet. It is the latest in the long run of blunt IAF verdicts on India's domestic fighter programs. Here's where the story stops being about a single delayed contract and becomes about structural dependency. Because the F404 saga is only an opening act. The engine chosen for the most advanced Tejas Mk1A, the AMCA, and the Navy's TED-BF, the twin-engined deck-based fighter, is a different, more powerful GE engine, the F414. In 2023, the United States approved licensed production in India with what was announced as an 80% technology transfer. Described at the time as more generous than any F414 deal GE had ever signed, more even than the 59% South Korea received for its own KF-21 program. Then commercial negotiations started and the number on the table changed. Initial estimates put the F414 at roughly $8 to $9 million. GE's revised quote for the AMCA prototype batch came in at 3 times the cost, 300% jump, which makes it up to $20 to $25 million per engine, just to set up a dedicated assembly line in India. Because the Mark II and AMCA airframes are custom built around the F14 engines, exact dimensions and software. Let me clarify this a bit. The engine forms the central component of any fighter aircraft. Because it's so central, the whole aircraft is designed around that engine, which means the airframe is created based on that particular engine. Because the Mark II and AMCA airframes are custom built around the F414's exact dimensions and software, walking away to Safran or Rolls-Royce at this stage would mean a 5 to 7 year design at the least, which is precisely the leverage GE is pricing in. Now let's look closely at what that celebrated 80% actually covers, because this is the part that rarely makes the headlines. GE has confirmed that it will transfer the machining and the coating of the single crystal turbine blades, but not the casting process, the step where a molten nickel superalloy is solidified into a single continuous crystal structure able to survive the temperatures, beyond the metal's own melting point without failing at a grain boundary. General Electric is also keeping the software for the full authority digital engine control system, the software that controls the engine, the FADEC, entirely to itself. It's not going to India. In plain terms, India is being taught how to finish and polish the blade, not how to grow it or make it. And it's being handed the steering wheel of the engine's brain without ever seeing what's under the hood. And here's the very uncomfortable truth Indian planners are running into. This isn't General Electric, Safran, Rolls-Royce, or the Russians being difficult for the sake of it. Single crystal casting and hot section manufacturing represents some of the most tightly guarded industrial secrets on the planet. The product of 60 to 70 years of innovation, trial, failure, and enormous sunk cost by a very small handful of countries. The US, Britain, France, Russia, and China, each of whom got there by the hard through decades of destroyed test blades, cracked turbine discs, and billions of dollars in failed prototypes before they even figured out exactly how to operate grain orientation in a super alloy casting. Now, these are metals that are approaching 2000 degrees Celsius in operation. That knowledge doesn't live on a manual somewhere, waiting for it to be copied and handed over. It lives in decades of accumulated, undocumented shop floor experience in furnace calibrations refined over thousands of casting cycles, in defect databases nobody publishes, and a small number of specialists who have spent entire careers on this one narrow problem. It is the industrial equivalent of asking a master chef for their signature dish. They'll teach you the knife skills, they let you plate the final dish, but the exact ratio and timing that makes it theirs is one thing that will never hand over to you. Because that's the one asset that makes them irreplaceable. That is why they are where they are. On top of that, these technologies sit inside export control regimes, like the American ITAR framework and the Missile Technology Control Regime, that treat propulsion technology as a matter of national strategic advantage, not just corporate intellectual property, which means that even a friendly government can't just simply order a company to hand over. So when India pushes GE or explores Safran and Rolls-Royce or alternatives, or even leans on Russia for full unrestricted transfer of hot section and crystal blade manufacturing, it's not really negotiating a business deal. It's asking for a handful of nations to give away the one advantage that took them 2 generations and immense national investment to build for free or almost free. No supplier, American, European, or Russian, has ever done that for anyone. And there's no real commercial or strategic incentive for one to start with India now, especially once they have already priced exactly how badly India needs this particular deal. Their airframes are built around the engine that is now too expensive and too wrapped up in political turmoil to start their airframe. Put the pricing and the technology ceiling together and you get a truly worrying timeline problem. HAL's own target for the first indigenously assembled F414 is mid 2029 at the earliest. And we all know how HAL has had the problem with delays upon delays. And that's before the actual AMCA squadron formation, which realistically pushes into the early to mid. Meanwhile, the aircraft that the AMCA is meant to compete with aren't standing still. China is already flying the 5th generation jets in meaningful numbers and has tested what analysts believe are 6th generation flight demonstrators. The F-35 program continues to mature and expand its user base. By the time an F-414 powered by AMCA is operational, running on an engine India doesn't fully own the manufacturing rights to, the aircraft it was benchmarked against may no longer represent the cutting edge. And because the crown jewel technology stays with GE, every future upgrade or reliability fix still runs through Washington rather than Bengaluru, which means that India isn't just late. It's permanently a step behind its own supplier on the one component that decides how the aircraft performs. A 5th generation fighter without full control over its propulsion is only ever going to be as modern as the mood of the company that built its heart. Which brings us to a question a lot of our viewers ask when they hear about GE's pricing leverage. Why doesn't India just walk away and use a different engine? The honest answer is that a fighter jet isn't built around a generic hole where any engine can just be fit in. It's built around one specific engine's exact dimensions, weight, and performance characteristics. And changing that is closer to a heart transplant rather than just a battery swap. The airframe intake geometry is precisely sized for that engine's airflow needs. Too small and it stops for air. Too large and you've added drag for nothing. The engine bay, mounting points, and the center of gravity are all controlled around one engine's exact weight and thrust line, and a different engine will sit differently, weigh differently, and shift the aircraft's balance in ways that ripple through every maneuver is expected to perform. The fuel systems, electrical systems, and hydraulic systems, and above all, the flight control software are all tuned to that specific engine's thrust response curve. And none of that carries over automatically to a different engine family. On top of the physical integration, every one of those interactions has to be revalidated through years of flight testing before a new engine airframe combination is cleared for operational squadrons. The exact process HAL itself has cited as the reason it is not even considering an engine swap for the Mk1A. And underneath all of that sits the sunk cost nobody likes to talk about. Years of negotiation, jointly developed tooling, a partially built supply chain, and a training pipeline Indian technicians have already built their careers around. Switching engines doesn't reset the clock to zero, it sets you back further because now you're underwinding the one partially completed integration before starting another. That's why even with GE's price nearly tripling, India is still at the table with GE rather than walking off to Safran or Rolls-Royce or the Russians. The leverage isn't just about money. Once you've designed a fighter jet around a particular engine, you have given that manufacturer a seat at your own negotiation table for the next 3 to 4 decades. Put all of this together and the picture is fairly stark. The IAF is roughly a dozen squadrons short of its sanctioned strength of 42, a fact that we've discussed and detail. You can watch our previous episodes to see this is discussed in more detail. The aircraft meant to close that gap has delivered just 6 engines out of 99 after 5 years, with formal induction now targeted for August or September this year. The next generation of engines meant to power the Mark II, the AMCA, and the TED-BF has nearly tripled in the price before a single engine unit has been assembled on Indian soil, and the technology India actually wanted, the ability to build its own crystal blades from scratch, was never really on the offer to begin with. And that's not a uniquely Indian problem. Every air force that imports its propulsion carries some version of this exposure. And Pakistan's own fleet runs on foreign engines too, from the American F-16 to the Chinese-sourced power plants in GF-17. The difference worth noting is scale and stakes. India has spent 40 years and tens of billions of dollars trying to build an independent fighter industry specifically to avoid this kind of exposure, and still ended up dependent on the pricing decisions of a handful of foreign boardrooms for the aircraft meant to anchor its own power for the next generation. That's not a reason for anyone across the border to celebrate. A stalled IAF modernization program isn't automatically good news for regional stability. It's simply a reason to watch closely how India navigates its way out of it, if at all. To bring this together, this was never really a story about one late engine shipment. It's a story of fighter programs that took 3 decades to reach its first squadron, that's been shaped as much by bureaucracy, shifting requirements, and a production monopoly as by any single mechanical failure. And that's now discovering that the one thing it actually needs, full ownership of hot section engine technology, was never something any supplier was realistically going to hand over. No matter how the contract was worded, no matter how much Vishwaguru India becomes, General Electric says the worst of the F404 crisis is behind it. The F414 negotiations for the Mark II and the AMCA remain unsolved. And the clock on staying technologically relevant keeps running whether the paperwork is finished or not. Whether India finally breaks the cycle with the AMCA or writes yet another chapter in the same 40-year story is something we'll all be following closely on this show. That's it for this episode of Radar Mode tonight. If this breakdown helped some of you connect some dots, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who follows regional defense and air power closely. It genuinely helps this channel grow more and reach more people who care about these issues. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I do read every one of them, and let me know what you'd like us to cover next. Until next time, this is Qasim signing off from Radar Mode on Pakistan Connect. Take care, stay sharp, and I'll see all of you next week.